start recording now.
Now, can you hear? You can hear me all right, can you? The mics at an okay level.
Perfect. Yes. Yes,
Good.
it's perfect.
Good.
Well, just to remind, this is an interview with Simon Humphreys, former director of CAS Computing at the SCONY in the UK. Is that correct? And the founder of that organization. One of the founders. And we are recording this interview for ADEL. ADEL is an organization in Latin America that is concerned about bringing digital education to mandatory schooling. So in particularly, ADEL wants to know about how other countries have introduced computational thinking into schools. And of course, England being the first one in reforming the curriculum and making it mandatory. It's one of our cases to do research.
Yeah.
So please, I'm going to ask some questions, but feel free to provide us with any information that you think it's relevant for us to learn, some opportunities to transfer some knowledge about what the UK has learned on how to take this knowledge into school, how to take this content into school. So the first thing that I was going to ask you is about your organization, CAS, and how long it has been in place.
Okay, so we started CAS, Computing at School, around about 2018, could be 2019, and started very small. Yeah, so what does that take us now? 11 years, 11, 12 years or so. So quite a long, it feels like a long time, but there were certainly moves going on prior to that time as well. But there wasn't anything official arranged or organized. And even when we started, it would be hard to describe it as official, but more of a guerrilla group or, collective volunteers. Concerned about the agenda and wanted to see what we could do to do about that agenda. It might be worth just giving a little bit of background. I kind of think it helps to provide a little bit of context, certainly from my own, the reason why I ended up in it partly. Yes. My real background, I've been a teacher ever since I left university, but I left university initially with a music degree. So I started off as a music teacher. And then at the late 20s, early 30s, I started to lose my hearing and so needed to retrain. I went back to university through a whole variety of circumstances and did a degree in computer science, then found myself teaching computer science at a very high achieving sixth form college here in Cambridge. And so a lot of my kind of thinking about the computing curriculum had been very informed by my prior experiences, both as a pupil and a student and as a teacher, with what it was like teaching music in schools. And my own personal story, because it provides a little bit of context into my reason for getting involved initially with computer science education and computing at school. So certainly over here, and I'm sure it's the same over there in Argentina, there's a very clear progression and a clear continuum, if you like, an understanding of music and its role in schools and education in general. Parents understand why children learn music, teachers do, the pupils do. It's part of the core curriculum almost before children start school, let alone when they first get into school. Music is part of the curriculum. And so what that then means then is that when pupils are beginning to get to examination phases, age kind of 15, 16 years old here in this country, for their first exams, there is a general assumption that they have done X years of music in school. So they have an understanding. They can play an instrument. They can probably read music. They're active listeners. They're actively participating in their music community, and their music understanding is sufficiently advanced. And it was the same thing if you then went on to do further study in A level in the UK here. The next layer of qualifications before you leave school. Again, you will be playing a musical instrument, you'll be able to read music and so on and so forth. And ditto when you enter university to study music, they don't teach you how to play the piano, they don't teach you how to read music. You've got some understanding of the history of music and the styles and forms, all that kind of stuff. And so clearly when you're then starting a degree in music, I distinctly remember we had lessons in things called keyboard harmony, which would be where you'd be looking at things like kind of Mozart string quartets. You've got 4 instruments and 4 violins and expected to be able to play that on the piano. It was just expected that you could do that. You weren't taught how to play piano. So that's a long story. When I then moved over into teaching computer science with my sort of 16-year-olds at that time, it seemed odd that they had done no computer science up to that point. So we were doing the equivalent of teaching them how to read music, and that was exactly the same experience that many students were having when they were entering university. So that there's no requirement on our universities for the students to have done any prior computer science at all, so that they would then also be teaching them how to, by analogy, read music or start to learn how to play the piano when they were entering into their programming classes. And this just seemed to be daft to me. So having had that whole level of coming to this subject completely fresh and completely new with some naive set of expectations, only to discover that, well, that doesn't exist. And that just seemed completely daft. And so I was spending quite a bit of time, even before we started computing at school, talking to other academics, talking to other industry people, and really asking these kind of level of very naive questions. You know, why are we not teaching our children computer science, the foundation of their digital world, upon which their entire digital world has been built? And yet what we're focusing on so much is that enabling children to use enabling children how to use these digital products, but not give them the foundational understanding about why they work in the way in which they do. And it just seemed to me, so I can't help myself, coming from that kind of arts background and music background, of thinking, surely we just need to teach these children how to play a musical instrument. Surely we need to teach these children some of the fundamental theories about how music is put together. Because then when they come to listen to other musics, then they're going to be much better informed. And also if they can then have the opportunity to perform those musics, they're just going to understand more about musical structures, musical forms, musical concepts. And I simply kind of flip that over in my head into computer science. Think, what should we be doing in computer science so that, you know, children of 7, 8, 9 and above are beginning to be taught and understand how their digital world works. And so they're developing this kind of computational model. So it was really through a number of those conversations that I was having with academics at university, principally, at that time, and also some industry connections as well, that just asking these naive questions and saying, what could we do? Now, clearly changing an entire school curriculum is an enormous challenge, and it needs weight, and it needs people, and it needs will. But we kind of formed this group, and it was through another, the founders I've worked very closely with over the last 10, 12 years, Simon Peyton-Jones, who's a researcher at Microsoft, who again, I'm sure that name will have come to you, but he's also a very eminent computer scientist in his own right and in his own field. But he experienced very similar thoughts when his children were going through schools, and having exactly the same thoughts of thinking he's dedicated his life to this most exciting of disciplines, and yet we just seem to be, so it seemed to him, seemed to be more or less just kind of teaching our children how to use PowerPoint or Microsoft Word or whatever, you know, Office products. You know, you've heard the arguments before, and it's not to that really isn't to kind of do a disservice to that, because I think that role has value and really important value. But for us, it seemed to be that no, we can do more than this and give them those underpinnings. So this group formed. Simon, the other Simon, got together, probably about 20 people back at the back end of 2018. Again, largely academics, industry, and a few teachers, and said, let's see what we can do about this. And we stayed under the radar for probably about 18 months. Just kind of taking soundings, gathering opinions, gathering thoughts, thinking through what some of the issues, some of the issues might be, before kind of potentially kind of forming this group called Computing at School more formally. So I'll pause there in case there's sort of supplementaries or additional questions.
Yeah, well, one of the things, let me see if I get the numbers straight. So in 2014, it was the reformed curriculum to make it mandatory in the UK. That's right. And
yes.
You formed this group in 2018.
Sorry, 2008, 2009. I'm getting my numbers.
Oh, no, maybe I misunderstood. So the CAS was formed previous to the
yes.
implementation of mandatory curriculum. Okay, no, now I understand.
Yes.
Maybe I
my apologies.
No, my mistake. And what were the main urgencies that you visioned to tackle computing at schooling when you formed this group? You already talked about the larger issue. What were the actions that you see in terms of programs?
The core issues were twofold. The first was to establish computer science as a subject discipline in schools.
Yes.
And that would sit alongside and be accepted as a norm, as we accept music and geography and history and all these other subjects in the school curriculum. In much the same way, we thought computer science should also be there, but also to be a subject discipline for pupils from primary school upwards. So as soon as children were entering into the school system, they should be learning some computer science. The adage that we took and used a lot at that time and still do, is that we live in a physical world, we teach physics. We live in a chemical world, we teach chemistry. We live in a digital world. What do? We teach them how to work process. And so that didn't make any sense. That was the first and really the big goal, was to get this subject into the school curriculum. And then the second goal was to provide support for teachers who were being tasked with teaching, who would be being tasked with teaching this this subject.
And what were the main actions that the CAS endeavored to provide this support to teachers?
Well, I suppose one of the first things that there's twofold here, I suppose. The first one was, we were frequently asked the question, well, if you want to teach this subject called computer science, what is it? I don't know what you mean when you say computer science. People thought, well, is it just programming, or is it something deeper and richer or different from? And how does that kind of connect with the more kind of ICT, information communication technology aspects of it? The second aspect, and this was again very much part of my own personal journey and personal story, is that if you are I'll use music as the analogy again, because it does equate. If you are a music teacher at school, you're likely to be the only one, or there might be two of you, so that you don't have a great rich resource of experience in terms of people that you can go to and ask for help from. And it was much the same if you were then teaching ICT in schools. You were likely to be a department of one or two. And you contrast that with science departments and maths departments when they may have upwards of 10 teachers teaching these subjects. So there was very much a strong feeling amongst many of us teachers at the time that, well, we just feel alone. So we need to know how we can connect to each other. And so one of the main focuses that we have developed within CAS was developing the notion of communities of practice amongst the teachers. enabling them to share their ideas, their resources, and so on and so forth. So it was less to do with us providing materials and resources top down, but more about kind of bottom up from the classroom, creating the kind of marching kind of clarion call, I suppose, to the agenda initially, because there wasn't any computer science. So it was really about trying to enable and encourage people to hear the message and say, do you think this is important? And if you do, why not join us? And so there was that kind of gathering of momentum and gathering people around us, but then enabling them and facilitating them to meet together to share their thoughts, share their ideas, share their resources, share the ways that they were teaching computer science within the curriculum that we had at that particular time. And so this kind of this community of practice model was very central. And the fact that we really feel as if, yes, it started in the classroom, it was very much teachers, with support from industry and support from academics, but very much how can we best draw alongside the teachers to empower them and enable to understand. So it was very much a bottom-up driven model rather than top-down.
And do you?
Well,
yeah, do you think that the professional development approach has evolved throughout the years for CAST?
Yes, it has, but in various ways. So clearly, one of our first targets was to get computer science into the school curriculum, and our initial forays into talking to our Department for Education at the government were unsuccessful, I think, to be blunt. But then they were undergoing a curriculum review, reviewing the whole of our national curriculum here in England, not rather than the UK, in England particularly. And so that provided more of an open door into getting into the department and talking with them about what we thought was important. And by that time, so we've been probably going about 5-6 years or so a long time.
Wow.
And this is what I don't think a lot of people from other jurisdictions appreciate, is that this was a long, slow burn of gathering momentum, describing what the curriculum could look like, what computer science in the school curriculum could look like. So creating these kind of more abstract documents, I guess, about what we thought the subject could look like and should look like in both primary and in secondary, as well as continuing to work alongside teachers through the kind of communities of practice that we were developing across the country. But we also formed a very important alliance with our British Computing Society, so the kind of professional body for those working in the IT industry. We had no formal status. We were just a guerrilla group. It was just a bunch of volunteers, really, a little bit of funding that we had from industry, Microsoft and Google in particular, to in the early days certainly pay for me to do spend some time on the project. But that was relatively small in comparison to where we are now. But the alliance with the BCS was significant in that they are a membership body. We were a membership body. They have a royal charter for developing and advancing the subject. So education was clearly going to be something that they were keen on, and they were able to give us legitimacy. So this alliance had with them was a partnership. We were never kind of at that time formally part of the BCS, but it was a very close collaboration between the two. And soon after we established that alliance, I effectively, as coordinator for computing at school, became an employee of BCS as well. But what that meant was that when we were then able to go to the Department for Education, we were able to go not as computing at school, this kind of ragtag collection of motley volunteers, but actually to go as the British Computer Society with the Royal Charter to say this is something that we believe is really important. And we were also able to go there as well because Simon Peyton-Jones, as I say, is a very eminent computer scientist in his own field and highly respected and highly regarded. That carried a huge amount of weight. So rather than me as a classroom teacher going to the DFE, I would have had the door slammed in my face. But we were able to go as the BCS, and we were able to go as representing the computer science academic research community as well. We were there representing and going alongside and with the support of some of the big companies like the Microsofts and the Googles and so on. And that kind of forced the hand a little bit of the government to listen. But there was a bit of a watershed moment when Eric Schmidt at, I forget what the year was now, probably 2011, 2012, spoke at a conference in Edinburgh, and he said that he was surprised that that computer science wasn't being taught as a formal subject in schools when you look back at the history of computer science invention and development here in England, the land of Tommy Flowers and the land of Alan Turing, etc., etc., etc. Why aren't you teaching more computer science? And that kind of had a bit of an impact of embarrassing the government to think, oh, yes, I think we probably should be doing a bit more on that. There were also a number of significant reports that we were part of. So the Royal Society published a report back in 2012, I think that was. Forgive me, I haven't quite got the dates right, but they again were looking at the issues of the role of ICT in the curriculum and computer science. There was also another very significant report that came out of an organization called Nesta on behalf of the games industry and the video effects industry, which is big here in England, all saying very much the same thing. We need to get computer science into the school curriculum. And so there were a number of those issues that just kind of tipped the balance over and enabled the government, as they were going through this national curriculum review, to think, yes, I think maybe now is a good time to make changes to the school curriculum and to put computer science into the curriculum. One of the things that they were concerned about, however, was the question, well, who is going to teach it? And there, of course, was where Kaz came in and said, look, I think at that time we had about kind of 1,500 members. We've got 1,500 members here who are really keen and wanting to get engaged in this process. We'll deliver it. We'll push that through for you. So 2014, the Minister of State for Education at the time, actually 2012, he disapplied the ICT curriculum, i.e. giving permission for schools not to teach ICT, but to develop their curricula to move forward more into computing and computer science. And then in 2014, the national curriculum had this new subject called computing built into it, with the expectation that schools would be delivering it in primary and secondary.
Well, that is so interesting. I mean, bringing a larger constituency to make your point and putting it in the public agenda through different reports, that's really give us a hint of where should we go. But now that you speak about...
Sorry, Sid, I was going to say, because I think it is worth emphasizing that I don't know what's like in Argentina, and I know I'm being recorded, but I'm maybe a little bit loose here where I say that teachers aren't listened to. So it's all very well kind of going to a government, but as an educator, you don't carry the weight that if you go in, if it's the CEO of Google who says something, then they're going to be listened to. If it's Professor Simon Peyton-Jones, he's more likely to be listened to. If it's the BCS, they're more likely to be listened to. But they go knowing that they have consulted and talked to teachers and are being informed by teachers who are there at the sharp end of the curriculum with their pupils, and having that level of support and encouragement from those organizations and those individuals was crucial, absolutely critical.
But then how does it play out when you bring it back to the teachers, that they feel maybe that this is imposed by the big companies and not their voices, but on the other hand, is it strategic to put these voices so that the contents are accepted? How does that play out?
Yeah, it's a good question, a good observation, of course. And I think it's from where I sat, the years before we had the national curriculum change, it was, I wouldn't say easy, but it was certainly easier to beat the drum and get people behind you, because it was,
Okay.
you know, it's easy, it's relatively easy to get people to join a march and, you know, wave a flag because they think it's something really important and they're the only ones doing it. And, you know, that you feel part of something that is exciting and, you know, potentially changing things. As soon as you then get this kind of directive from the top saying,
Right.
you now must teach this, then you're much more likely to get people putting up some barriers and saying, "Oh, I don't think this is right or important at all." You know, so
Right. We were
that
not consulted about this.
yes, right. So that has been certainly harder, and I think it's, you know, how do you change a curriculum? It's enormously difficult. I mean, so many studies written about how you manage curriculum change, how you develop innovation in school curriculum, how you embed that innovation. It's phenomenally difficult and it's phenomenally challenging. And no one has ever underestimated that. But you do need to bring the teachers with you. And I think that one of the key aspects is that so many of us that were involved in CAS did know what it was like to be shut out of our ICT suite on a wet Friday afternoon because somebody else needed it. You know, we kind of knew what, we had that kind of visceral sense of, we know what it's like in the classroom. We know this can be difficult. We know you haven't got enough time, but we're here to help and support you. Which is why I was a huge believer and still am a huge believer in this notion of the community of practice and really kind of trusting the teacher. They know their pupils, they know their curriculum, they know their own comfort zones as well. And so whilst I think, you know, these communities, they were informal, there wasn't a kind of formal curriculum or schedule that we followed through these communities of practice. It was very much driven by volunteers, but those volunteers were teachers who were willing to open their classrooms up to other teachers and just talk and just share ideas and enable them to share their own ideas as well, and just kind of collectively move the agenda on or raise the temperature, whatever metaphor one wants to use, just by a few degrees each time. And if you met 3 or 4 times a year, you know, by the end of that year, you'd look back and think, well, actually, my comfort zone has now widened just a little bit. And then it goes another little bit and another little bit. But it's, you know, but that has certainly had to change. So when when the curriculum was brought in, we were tasked with a program of professional development for teachers from the government, which was funded. Not a huge amount of money, but enough. And the program that we then ran there with their funding, we called it the network of excellence was the short name, but the network of I forgot the full name. Network of Excellence for the Teaching of Computer Science in Schools. We put excellence in there because we knew that head teachers wanted their schools to be excellent. So that we created a network of excellence, but it was very much formed around this communities of practice model, so that if you had, you know, 10 teachers meeting, it's quite likely that there would be one person who would know a little bit more about the subject than maybe 5 of the others. And so we would be looking to find those, to recruit them, and then to give them some training. And we called them master teachers for a whole variety of reasons, some good, some bad, but that was the name that we chose. And so we were tasked with recruiting a number of these master teachers each year, and they would be tasked with providing more formal CPD, more kind of formal, more taught CPD. So kind of putting another layer on top of these communities of practice. So if a teacher said, well, I'm really struggling with teaching, you know, loops in Python, somebody said, well, I'll put a course on for that for you, and we'll do that in a month's time, and this will be it. Da, da, da. And so the Master Teacher Network was formed. And I forget the numbers, but I think we recruited something like kind of 500-600. I know I'm being recorded, but don't quote me. I've not got the numbers to hand. But over a period of 5 years, we recruited a number of those, and they were tasked with providing more formal training as professional development, and was hugely successful. And in the latter part of that program, because we had so many of these teachers, a level of coordination was required, and so we engaged with 10 universities in the country to kind of oversee the work of those master teachers, to be responsible for the finding, the recruiting, and the training, and the assessing of the impact, etc., through these university colleagues. And that ran for 5 years. And one of the outcomes of that was that it was clear that the program itself was successful, but it wasn't reaching anywhere near enough schools and classrooms. The level of funding wasn't sufficient, and there were probably flaws in the way the program was being run in that basis as well. You couldn't recreate this at scale. And again, I forget my dates, it's probably maybe 2.5, 3 years ago, the government announced a significant tranche of funding for a 3-4 year period to create the National Centre for Computing. And then that was formed with a partnership of 3 organisations, of which the BCS was one, by which time CAS had really become much more part of the BCS outfit. And the Raspberry Pi Foundation, and a group called the STEM Centre as well. So that consortium was created with these 3 organisations to really develop what we had started with the Network of Excellence, maintain these communities of practice, but actually provide on top of that the kind of top-down provision of training and resources, both classroom-based resources as well as CPD resources and other materials, to really kind of accelerate the training that could be provided.
Well, that was very clear about the professional development. Thank you. I want to ask you one more question, if you allow me. I don't know, how are you with time? I could talk to you all day.
Although I've stepped down as national coordinator, it still remains a passion of mine, so I can
it's very interesting. But in terms of the curriculum issues, I mean, here we have in Latin America the tension between assigning this as an assignment, as a course with the curricular space of its own, or as an integrated subject. Because with this idea of that computational thinking, it's an abstract development of the mind that it could be transferred to other disciplines. So if you do problem solving in math, then you're doing computational thinking. Therefore, we don't need a subject area for computer sciences. So we're in the midst of that debate. How did that play out in England, and how did you manage to put it as a subject of its own? What were the discussions that you have, and what conclusions did you arrive? How did you manage to take away a subject as ICT? Well, I don't know if you see where I'm going with this question.
Yes, there's a number of issues in there, I think, aren't there? Do we start? I mean, I think there are a number of broad issues. There is it was never the intention to take away ICT and replace it with computer science. Mm-hmm. It's more about providing an alternative view, I suppose, of looking at that subject and beefing up, putting more of computer science into that same curriculum space. so that if you have a school curriculum with its 12, 13 subjects, and you think of them as kind of, vertical slots during any particular week, you do your history, you do your maths, you do your computing, whatever it is. We simply thought, no, within that vertical slot of computing, we should be teaching our children how these machines work. We should be teaching them more about how to be more creative, certainly through programming and the like, but so that they would end up with a model of computation in their heads that made sense, in the same way that we would be teaching, physics in school in this kind of vertical strand, and that by the time that child had stopped studying physics, they had a model of their physical world in their head. However imperfect that may be, if you then spoke to advanced physicists, I have an understanding in my head. I stopped learning about physics when I was 14, or formally in schools, but I have a model in my head of how the physical world is put together, and Newtonian physics and gravity, and how an atom is formed. And I'm sure if I was to speak even to a physicist who did 3 or 4 more years study than me, would tell me your model's not quite right, but it's okay. Do you know what I mean? And so what I really wanted within this computing curriculum was that when a child stopped studying computing, age 14 or 16 or 18, they had a model of their digital world that made sense, being built on some of the fundamental principles of computer science. And that's kind of the vertical strand. But there is, of course, this horizontal strand as well. And here that the role of technology to enhance learning has a role to play in every single subject. Now, that was never something that we wanted to get involved in, and really thought, no, because there are other organizations who are looking after the use of technology in mathematics or in geography or music or wherever else. Now, clearly, there is a very significant role. My personal view, and I just emphasize it very much, this is my personal view, as a teacher, I would be asked to ensure that my children were spelling correctly, and I would be ensuring that my children were enforcing basic numeracy, and I'd be making sure that my children weren't being bullied. There were sort of kind of broad issues and broad themes that I, as a teacher, would be needing to be looking at and taking care of, that had nothing to do with me being a music teacher or a geography teacher. And I put this sense of use of technology and use of ICT into that camp, to be honest. And I think that just as I need to ensure that my children are numerate and literate, and they're being kept safe, I need to make sure that my children understand how technology is having an impact on my subject, whether I happen to be a geographer or a historian or a musician or a computer scientist. Now, as I say, we never got involved in that debate. When we were tasked with looking at the national curriculum, some of us, I was one of them, thought, for example, that issues to do with, I'm going to use the phrase digital literacy, but it's such a misused and misunderstood phrase, but the kind of the how to use and how to keep safe and awareness of opportunity with use of technology for learning. I thought that should be a subsection in every single school curriculum subject, not just within the computing curriculum. I didn't win out on that. Okay, maybe the next time the curriculum is changed, it'll be looked at as something different. But I think that the role, and it's become really important, hasn't it, as we've seen over this last 2-3 months of the lockdown. That more and more teachers are now having to engage with technology for teaching. They're being absolutely forced to. And it's not been straightforward, and it's not been easy. We won't know whether it's been hugely successful or not, but they're having to use the technology, which I think is a good thing. And the same way the children are having to use the technology, so much more. And whether that will then have an impact when we go back to kind of face-to-face teaching, whenever that may be, I don't know. But there's no doubt in my mind those two things are really important. Not one is more important than another, and they need to be held in balance somehow. But they're not quite the same thing either. So that how we use the technology to enhance learning as a geographer or a historian will be different to and from what we're teaching our children in kind of more kind of theoretical, if you like, computer science in the vertical strand. You know. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, but how did the government or actually make the criteria to put the subject on computing instead of a more transversal themes? How was it finally decided? Because it's a big project to take. I mean, and politically, it's a big move, right? Where you can have, it's a very risky move politically. I can imagine the teachers' unions of ICT protesting because they're from one day to another, they take away their subject. And also there are good statements of why ICT, it's important, like you mentioned, it's very, we all agree it's important that children learn ICT. How was it decided? What were the debates around this dispute?
Gosh, and I'm going to taking me back a long time. I mean, I don't know if it answers the question from a practical point of view, but there are a number of stakeholder meetings, stakeholder groups, with different sets of people largely present at each of those, kind of chewing over and working through what this curriculum should look like and what this curriculum should contain, thinking about some of the fundamental aims. The groups were tasked with creating a kind of an overview, if you like, the kind of aims and principles of the curriculum for primary and secondary. And I think, not joking, to be done on two sides of A4 paper. So very, very high level. And then the kind of interpretation of those statements, the program of study and the aims of the curriculum, I'm sure you've seen those, they're available, will then be interpreted by each individual school individually, you know, so that here in England, we don't have a national education service. You know, every school effectively works independently from each other. It's not entirely true. There is some connections within some schools who are kind of formed together in academy trusts and chains, and perhaps still under local authority authority as well. But you know, by and large, an individual school can make a decision about what they teach, how many hours they want those subjects to be given, etc., etc. So it's up to them to interpret those programs of study, rather than, I know in some jurisdictions, forgive me, I don't know how it works in Argentina. So, you know, we have this national curriculum, but the national curriculum per subject, it's two sides of A4. So the interpretation of that is very much down to individual schools. So it's very much thinking about the principles and the aims behind the subject. The discussions, the persuasion that went on, you know, I think that a lot of the groundwork had been laid through the reports, such as the Royal Society, very eminent here and very influential here, the views of industry, so that we were making both an economic case for the reason why our children need to be better equipped to work in their digital world. So the economic case was being made, as well as the educational base, the educational argument being made as well, and really on both those sides. And it's hard for me, I suppose, because I sit on one particular side of the argument, and I can't see how anybody could possibly ever disagree with this argument. Just so blindingly obvious, you know. in the same way I think all children should learn how to play music, all kids learn how to program. But so it became, it was one of those things that the time was right. You know, it was as if the planets had aligned, and it was just that moment. There was this window of opportunity when the government was doing the curriculum review. There was also concern at the time that the number of students going on to take computer science at university was had fallen by a half. Significant numbers of job vacancies in tech companies. The growing awareness that more and more companies, whatever the you know, if they were in retail or if they were in banking, whatever the nature of this particular company, they're IT companies. You know, a bank is just an IT company that sells finance. You know, and our supermarkets, they're IT companies, but they're selling products. You know, we're all working for IT companies, and we need people that understand the IT, not just can use it. So the argument was relatively easy to make, and the government were eventually, it'd be fair to say, receptive. I'm not entirely sure they fully got it, but you know, the development took place, and the development happened. It hasn't been straightforward. I mean, I think there's another side to this, is that of course, I think one of your questions that you sent through before, you know, what might you have done differently?
Yes, I was going to ask you that last question.
Yeah, well, you know, the key group that we didn't do enough with were the school leaders and the head teachers.
Interesting.
Because certainly here in England, where they have significant power to determine what gets taught. I mean, we have and again, a bit of context, I suppose, an unusual situation here that we have schools that receive money from the government. Hitherto, or going back some time, we had a system of local authorities, and the local authorities would receive the money from the government, and that money would then be disseminated out to the schools. So there was a much more kind of hierarchical structure to the way in which the curriculum was being delivered. Well, schools effectively moved to, they created them. Schools were able some years ago to become academies, which meant that they came out of the local authority control and received the money directly. Well, academies don't have to follow the national curriculum if they don't want to. They have even more power over power is the wrong word. I'm struggling to come up with the right word. I'll keep using power for the moment. But to decide the balance of subjects and the amount of time those subjects get in those particular schools. And concomitant with that is that then schools are judged and schools are assessed on performance based on examination results, largely at secondary schools, where maths and English have double weight, so that they're really going to focus a lot on their maths, they're going to focus a lot on their English. Science also has a very strong cachet for these subjects. Computer science doesn't have quite such the same level of influence on head teachers, because it's not going to necessarily be affecting their final performance figures when they're looked at being assessed through government metrics. Right. And so this then has an impact, the incentive, correct. This has a significant impact on whether head teachers are choosing to put computing into the curriculum or not, or how much time they're being given, added to which it's hard to find teachers to teach the subject. However much money one throws at it, or training or professional development, there is no doubt that if you leave university with a computer science degree, you can earn more very, very quickly if you go and work at a local bank rather than you can to become a teacher. So that's all clouded into this whole space, which again adds to where we were earlier on in our conversation, that making change happen in education is phenomenally hard. You know, so we've been at this since the mid 2000s, and we're now sitting at 2020, and we're not there yet. You know, this is a long-term development and long-term change for a whole number of reasons and factors. But believing in coming back to my kind of fundamental point, I suppose, is believing in the teachers and working alongside those teachers with the support of academics and industry and others. We have shown has had a great deal of impact, or we still have a long way to go for really embedding this subject into the school curriculum. People still don't quite understand it. People are still happy to think that it's just programming. We'll just teach them programming. That'll be fine. I think, no, it's not just about programming. You know, like with music, it's not just about playing a musical instrument. That's not the point of it. You know, it's about teaching the fundamental concepts, the fundamental principles of this subject. And as you're alluding to, the kind of computational thinking, the way we think about our digital world, which has application across all subjects. You know, we're still not quite able to make that case as strongly as we would like to, but you just have to keep chipping away at it. Sorry, I think I've kind of gone off the question a little bit, but
no, that was very, very clear. The last part, I mean, it's something that the same things we're dealing with here, trying to establish what is computer science is much more than programming. And just review an article from Inroads that basically propose to only teach programming so that the kids in the US can pass the AP exam. Yeah. But that's a move backwards, because teaching to the test is not the only thing schools should do. And it certainly doesn't address the fundamental concepts of computer science. So, well, I can't thank you enough. I'm going to stop the recording now.
That's fine. The analogy I always used with that, Cecilia, was again